Hello everyone and welcome back to another installment from our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Zespri's sustainable packaging lead, Patterson, shares how the world's largest marketer of kiwifruit measures and uses packaging metrics within the global supply chain. Our very own Technical Director, Jeff Vickers, will discuss the most relevant international trade requirements for packaging and how to tackle them. Here's a sneak preview.
For many companies in New Zealand and Australia where we're export oriented and we're exporting often to many third countries, many of our clients have 50 or 100 export markets. I think there's a great degree of complexity in working out what is recyclable, what is compostable in those markets.
What Zespri wants to be is a market leader in sustainable packaging. End-of-life evidence is another challenging area, again, because sometimes the data just isn't there to say in reality, which is, that there has to be recyclable, reusable in reality, in practice. And of course, that data is often not there. There's a whole lot of regulatory pressure coming our way, which is great, particularly in Europe, as one of the leaders, to be fair. Product environmental footprint's one of those, for example, and that's going to require us to actually present sustainability metrics that extend way beyond our packaging and represent what our product footprint is, of which packaging is a component.
Product packaging has been in the spotlight as consumers' concern about single-use packaging and plastic in the environment continues to grow. Additionally, an increasing number of international trade and export requirements affect global supply chains. These include the Plastics Pact 2025, led by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and the Green Deal in Europe. With that, let's get started.
Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Sustainable Packaging Metrics in a Global Supply Chain together with Zespri. We're delighted to have you with us for this Straight from the Horse's Mouth webinar, Insights from Experts in 30 minutes. It's great to see you all, and it's great, and I think this is a really important topic. I think there's been sustainable packaging has been something that's been talked about for a very long time, and it's great to see that we're kind of finally getting some traction and seeing some things actually happening in the real world. I'm joined today by our co-host and co-presenter, Patterson, the Sustainable Packaging Lead at Zespri. Lewis has been a champion of packaging and sustainability for a very long time, and it's really great to have him on the call with me today. Rather than bore you to tears with details from my side, I was just hoping to take a few minutes just to talk about sustainable packaging more generally before I pass over to Lewis and get out of the way to give him the floor. I think there's been a lot of work that's been developed around the various plastics pacts around the world to try and phase out plastic packaging. And I think it's also really exciting to see things like carbon footprinting developing around that. So all of the 2025 targets that many companies have signed up to make their products and packaging, so their packaging 100% compostable, recyclable, or reusable by 2025, they probably seemed like a long time ago when people were signing up to them. And I guess 2025 is just around the corner. And so increasingly, as we move forward, we need to think about how we do things faster, how we measure how we're going, how we track performance against a goal. And I think that's why we were really keen to invite Lewis along today and to show some of the work that Zespri has been doing to really track performance and measure and set a really solid baseline. Because I think for many companies in New Zealand and Australia where we're export oriented and we're exporting often to many third countries, many of our clients have 50 or 100 export markets. I think there's a great degree of complexity in working out what is recyclable, what is compostable in those markets. It's easy to say something is 100% recyclable or compostable, but it always depends on the local context. Is there the right infrastructure in place to do so? Is there, industrial composting infrastructure available? Even if it exists, will it take the packaging that we have, because it could be cross-contaminated? If that doesn't exist, it's home compostable, are the products certified to the right standards? If it's recyclable, that's great, but do recycling facilities actually exist for that particular pack format and market? And often when you get into the detail, it becomes even more complicated. You can talk about PET or clear PET being a very recyclable material, but then you get into the differences between bottled PET and thermoform PET, and all of a sudden it starts to become even more complicated. And when you're exporting to both developed and developing countries, you've also got challenges in vastly different waste infrastructure, and that all creates a huge degree of complexity for how you actually set benchmarks, how you set baseline values, and how you track your progress over time. And so Lewis is someone who faces these challenges on a day-to-day basis and is someone who's been really trying hard to address them. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lewis Patterson, the Sustainable Packaging Lead at Zespri, to talk about their journey and some of the things that they've been up to. So over to you, Lewis.
Thanks for the invite, Jeff. Yeah, you've rounded off a few key points there. And what I was hoping to land during this brief presentation today was really two key points. And one is the importance of sustainability metrics or environmental metrics in today's business environment, and also how they can be applied in practice. And I'm obviously going to be using the Zespri as a case study in this particular instance. And of course, there's many other ways you can tackle it. And I will touch on a lot of the key points you've just raised as we work our way through. How I'll take you through this is just start with looking at the journey that Zespri's on. Might sound like a naff term, but it is very true. We are on a journey as we work towards an end goal, and I'll tackle our targets and other influencing factors on how and what metrics we secure and measure. I'm also going to look at the supply chain context, because that's a critical part of what defines what metrics we need to gather and how we calculate them, and also how we interpret them. And then I'm going to look at the specific approach we took, because we took a kind of a modular approach to our metrics for various reasons I'll delve into. And it wouldn't be a presentation on sustainability metrics without delving into some of the challenges which Jeff has already raised. So I'll look at that as well. I was going to dive into some opportunities that robust sustainability or environmental metrics give you as part of your brand proposition, but we're not going to have time during this webinar. So Jeff, you might want to set up a new one for that topic on its own. But let me kick in. I think I've extracted or removed any key jargon or complicated phraseology that would be confusing, but if there are some, please sing out and I'll let Jeff interrupt me and I can clarify as we go through. Moving straight into the background, like I said, Zespri is on a journey, and if I start at the right-hand side of the current slide, what Zespri wants to be is a market leader in sustainable packaging. And yet to get there, obviously there are a lot of different steps. And the first step really is to establish the knowledge base. And what I mean by the knowledge base is we have to understand what we wanted to measure and the framework within which we wanted to measure it. So the methodology and how we would apply those metrics in our specific business case. And in the case of Zespri, we also had a requirement to actually get better visibility of our packaging. And it'll become clear to you why in subsequent slides. But in many cases, we didn't have a clear understanding of what packs our fruit were presented in. And certainly in many cases, we didn't know the design or the detailed specifications of those packs that would enable us to account for their environmental impact. We also had to establish the processes to ensure that we can continue to collect that data in a robust and reliable manner. Right now, we're really in the thick of finding new solutions, and that's thanks to having secured those metrics in that building stage that I've highlighted there on that slide. And that, gathering these metrics is all about finding genuine sustainable solutions. So with the background of those metrics, we're out there prototyping new packs, measuring the impact, but also talking to our partners in the supply chain, so be that the retailers or the distributors, to ensure that the pack is functionally working as well as delivering better sustainable results. And then we've got value. So again, I would have loved to talk more about this, and maybe that's something we can talk about later. But there's a huge amount of value that can be secured and that sustainable metrics can add to a brand when presented well as part of your product position. And that's something else we'll start to leverage as we go through this. I also want to give you a broader context, just step back a little bit. We're going to talk about packaging today. That's why it's highlighted there in the slide. But Zespri has a range of different priorities that we're focused on. One, understandably, not surprisingly, is our kiwifruit. The other is the environment and also our communities. But for this session, we're strictly focusing on packaging, although I will touch on some of the future trajectory of what the sustainability metrics might apply to outside of packaging as well. And to help guide the discussion and help you understand why we've taken the approach we have, I've highlighted the specific targets that we are working towards. So Jeff just mentioned the Ellen MacArthur Foundation New Plastics Economy targets. Yes, very short time frame. Jeff, seemed like a long time ago for many companies when they signed up to it. It's not. The targets 1 and 2 relate specifically to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation New Plastics Economy commitments. And Jeff mentioned them. Our packaging will be 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable. And that is across plastic and non-plastic. It's not specific to plastic. Where we do use plastic, yes, we need to secure 30% recycled content of those plastic packs. An additional target that we put in there is around the carbon footprint, and we've committed to reducing our per kg of fruit carbon footprint by 25% by 2030. And again, absolutely critical to be able to establish a firm baseline in order to be able to measure progress towards that goal. But these targets alone don't completely dictate what we need to do for our packaging, because there's a whole raft of other external pressures that we are under and need to respond to, be they pressures from the consumers or our customers who have their own targets they need to meet. And if we want to supply into that channel, we have to meet their conditions as well. And there's a whole raft of regulations coming our way as well that will force our hand in other areas over and above what we've just set out here in our targets. I'm going to give you some supply chain context as well before launching into how we calculated our metrics. And the reason for that is, to show that at a high level, you look at Zespri's packaging mix, it's relatively simple, certainly a lot simpler than many other export businesses out there. But the complication comes later. When we first started looking at what metrics to measure, we set out all the packaging components, and we said, okay, where as a key material, where the materiality lie, what areas should we focus on? Because you always want to put all your effort into where you can make the biggest impact. We also had to assess, and I'll come back to this, where we had the most control. So as I mentioned briefly, consumer packs were not an area we had the most control, but we had to do something about it. And we had to do something about consumer packs because of perception, but also because they were going to increase in terms of the impact we had on the environment. And that perception is key. So if we looked at it from a materiality perspective, labels, if I could call them out, they might be less than 1% of our packaging by weight, less than 0.5% of our carbon footprint for packaging. And yet, in terms of perception from the consumer side, they get a lot of pressure, a lot of focus, and that has translated into regulatory pressure as well. So it's almost forced our hand. Actually, to be fair, we were already looking at it, but in Zespri's case, we've had to put a lot more focus and bring a lot of that work forward to account for regulatory change in that space. And I've mentioned the supply chain again. It relates to something Jeff said earlier. So our supply chain, fairly standard supply chain, where we export a lot of fruit out of New Zealand, the majority out of New Zealand, and it gets transported overseas. It goes through the regulatory hurdles at the border, and it goes to our warehouse, through our distributors, wholesalers, and then into the retailers, and ultimately into our hands as a consumer. So relatively straightforward supply chain, except that in our case and in many other cases, it's a little bit like Alice shooting down the rabbit hole. You jump down from your world and you pop your head out into a completely different environment. And in Zespri's case, we're popping ahead up into over 50 countries around the world, and you're having to account for different people, how consumers use your product in each and every market. There are different infrastructure, Jeff's already mentioned it, that you have to account for to basically enable the product to be recycled, but also in terms of the metrics, how you measure and how you account for the impacts of that different infrastructure. And you've got different regulations as well, as I've mentioned before. So each country has its own regulations, which means when you're funneling product through one point in New Zealand, that one pack does sometimes have to fit for multiple different markets. So there's a huge complexity in meeting those requirements. And this leads me into how we approached our metrics to try and account for those complexities of the supply chain. What we wanted was the ability to utilize our metrics to make tangible change and positive, sustainable difference to our pack mix. And we also wanted to be able to utilize those metrics in a manner that allowed us to model different scenarios through a supply chain. So we could start looking at systems change as well as pack changeouts. You can change from plastic. If you're looking at your consumer pack, you can change from plastic to card, and you can measure that change relatively easily. But what else can we do from a systems perspective from the beginning of the supply chain through to the consumer? And that's where a modular approach that we adopted has proven very helpful. We have, in terms of the reporting, we're focused on the plastic and carbon, but we are also measuring a number of other sustainability metrics, including the eutrophication potential, water, for example, PED, which many of you will also be familiar with. I was going to look at how they can be utilized and who's demanding information in those areas. I'm not going to do it in depth, but it'll be very helpful to us going forward to ensure that we continue to monitor not just carbon, but a number of those other metrics. And I also noted earlier on that one of our commitments around carbon was against the kg of fruit. And the requirement there is, of course, to calculate how much fruit you've delivered in the market and then register that back against the net carbon impact of the pack itself. So again, the modular approach we've taken has helped us enable that measurement to be made. The reason I gave the context of our supply chain and highlighted areas where we don't have as much control, such as the consumer packs, is because data robustness is absolutely critical in setting a reliable baseline and also giving clear direction as to what alternative packs would make a significant difference on our impact on the environment. And that's one of the biggest challenges, because we've been on a journey, but not everyone else in the supply chain necessarily has. And in order to get robust sustainability metrics, we do need a very low level of detail on our packaging. So we're pushing and advocating to our partners to provide that data, and that's not always easy. Equally, we need that internal resource within Zespri to be able to chase that data, collate it, and update it into the systems that we've developed specifically for that purpose. So that's a key challenge that's ongoing, obviously, and we've got a number of programs in place to try and address that. Jeff mentioned it earlier on again, the end-of-life evidence is another challenging area, again, because sometimes the data just isn't there to say in reality, which is, that there has to be recyclable, reusable in reality, in practice. And of course, that data is often not there. So we're reliant on sometimes sketchy data in some countries where it's not as well monitored. And then there's interpretation. I've put a couple of pictures to the right of the slide. The top one there is about a program we're implementing in Singapore. So it's not in trial stage yet, but it will be soon, where we've looked at saying, okay, in Singapore, the end-of-life pitch is not good for PET, which was our incumbent pack. Let's trial a reuse pack. And that's good, but we need to be able to validate how many times a pack such as that is reused, because that directly influences how sustainable that pack is. Equally, I've got a picture there in Japan where we've got a bucket which is presented to the market, and that could be reused. But how do you define reuse? If it's not reused for the same purpose that it was put on the shelf for, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that isn't reuse, because it's not been used to present the kiwifruit again. So there's a whole lot of things going on in that space that we need to be very clear about and transparent about, and need to be presented in our metrics as well. In the near future, again, this topic's come up already. There's a whole lot of regulatory pressure coming our way, which is great, particularly in Europe, as one of the leaders, to be fair. Product environmental footprint's one of those, for example, and that's going to require us to actually present sustainability metrics that extend way beyond our packaging and represent what our product footprint is, of which packaging is a component. And what we're going to have to do is make sure that our metrics align with the framework that the product environmental footprint is demanding. So there we've got a challenge as well. And that leads me into the second one, which is, have we got the right tool to deliver it, to meet those regulatory demands? So to date, to help us with that modular framework that we had set up, we've used the Gabby packaging calculator, which has been great. But what that doesn't give us is the ability to account for innovation within the supply chain. You might have a supplier that has gone 100% carbon neutral in the energy, for example, installed a whole lot of panels on their roof. And currently, given the tool we're currently using, we can't really account for that effectively. Equally, if we were to collect our own packaging at end of life, we lose the flexibility to be able to calculate or include that in our calculations. So we have to keep ahead and make sure that that tool also has flexibility. Carbon neutral offerings, similar to the regulatory pressures, if we're going to claim carbon neutrality, we've got to be very sure of our carbon impacts. And again, all those challenges that I've mentioned before around the end of life and the supply chain determine that that isn't as simple as it might look from the outside. And I also say that the consumers are totally on top of this in many cases. We've had questions come through from consumers challenging, is your recycled plastic content post-consumer? So they're very aware of the difference between post-consumer, post-industrial. And equally, they will be calling any company or brand out when it comes to the footprint claims that are being made. And that's it. I was going to, again, I won't delve into the opportunities, but I do think it's something worth discussing at a much greater depth in the subsequent session, maybe, Jeff, because as you secure these metrics, they can and should add value to the brand. And again, that's because the consumer and customers are demanding that transparency and detail on what the impacts from a company or a brand are. So maybe there's space for that at the next webinar. But there's a very nuts and bolts presentation, which was to answer the request from Jeff. And I'm hoping there's some questions on that.
Thank you very much
from the audience.
Really interesting discussion there. So thanks, really appreciate that. So might go straight across to the questions. So the first one's from Sahar, and he's asking, how did you convince your suppliers, the ones that aren't cooperative? How do you work with the ones that don't want to cooperate with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and we haven't convinced all of them yet. So it's an ongoing dialogue, and the way we have to convince them is, there's a number of ways. There's the stick and the carrot, of course, depending on how the relationship sits, but the best way is to show value. And there is a way to show value to your suppliers and also to your distributors at the other end, i.e. your share of market will reduce over time if we do not meet these criteria. There are other value aspects as well. You can look at your core values around the consumer, your employees. There's a whole lot of other benefits that we need to start surfacing to try and convince suppliers and your partners down the supply chain. But it's an ongoing task, quite frankly. It's still not something I'd say we've solved 100%.
Good, thank you. Next question is from Simon, and he asks, is there an inherent clash between the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Plastic Pact target and the carbon reduction goals? Are they in conflict at times?
At times, yes. So if you look at our last target around the carbon, we looked at card options that would meet the supply chain requirements of our packaging in terms of robustness, design, visibility, all those aspects. And when we did some of the initial prototypes, the goal was to meet targets 1 and 2 and remove or include recycled plastic, but remove plastic, exchange for card. In some cases, that did increase our carbon footprint per kg of fruit. So at times, absolutely, there is a conflict, and that's something we have to work with and make a sound judgment on. But certainly the key goal is to say any replacement of plastic or exit of plastic doesn't increase that footprint, but it's not always easy. Yeah. Functionality has to still be there. And one of the critical components there is, fruit loss as well. So we're looking at ways to make sure we're even better at calculating the impacts of fruit loss if we transition out of plastic into card.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that we often observe is that you can often get away with much lighter weight plastic packaging for the same function, whereas if you go to a card, you might have quite a heavyweight packaging. Correct. Which obviously good from a recycling perspective, but it does create a challenge from that carbon footprint perspective. Next question was from Kate, and she asked, what was your approach, or what is your current approach to uncertainty and data uncertainty in your supply chain? How do you manage the uncertainty in the data?
Yeah, another great question. So we're basically, materiality is one of the first cutoffs that we're looking at. If it's very small in terms of the materiality, we may not chase it to the degree that we would where we know it's going to have a big substantial impact on our footprint. But the best thing, and what we're trying to do in all cases, is actually secure that data, make it easier for the providers of that data to give it to us and allow us to calculate it. We haven't got it every single time, so we have to also, in some cases, make some assumptions on what it would be based on what we have secured in terms of our data, which is quite robust. So we can make some fairly good educated calls on what a pack weight might be, for example, when it's in a very similar design to another pack we've got in our system.
And I think it is like the point you make, it's important to have something to compare against, right? So you know what you're expecting, and then you can probably start to judge, what is the relative quality of this? What is the likely issues? Yeah. Next question is about tracking and communicating metrics. So how do you track your metrics and how do you communicate them effectively?
Again, work in progress in all of that. We've established a system to capture the data in the first instance, and that was a critical first step. So like I said early on in the presentation, we didn't have a clarity on all our packs, and we didn't have a system to put it into that was easy to was consistent and easy to monitor. Now we have, and that's the first step, so that we've got a consistent way of entering our data into a system. And also through that system is how we track it. And that's on we can do it on a year by year basis. And we can also break it down by, material types, pack types, country, region. And that's really critical in terms of our, again, materiality assessment, but also where we focus our efforts to develop new alternative packaging.
Mm-hmm. Great. Final question we have now is how you had the product environmental footprinting logo from the European Union up before. How much has Zespri engaged in the PEF pilots?
We haven't as such. So this was something that we've looked at as in very early stages to say, okay, what's coming our way? Mm. So we've just done that initial high level assessment. It's something that we've flagged and know that it's something we will have to get close to. Mm-hmm.
And I know that
in the near future,
the PEF, when they were running the PEF pilots, they had quite a few categories. Was there one that was specific to your product, sort of packaging more generally?
I can't recall, to be honest, Jeff.
Yeah. No, I mean, it doesn't matter because there's the methodology, right? There's the high level methodology, and there was also all of the individual pilots.
That's right.
And I remember, I think there was one that would have affected like dairy products, for example, from memory, and there was a series of others, but I've lost the thread of which ones there were in the end.
And that's right. And our focus to date in terms of the PEF has been around the methodology primarily. I.e., given that methodology, where's our methodology sit and do they align? Because if we're going to comply with that methodology, we're going to have to look at our current methodology in terms of approaching our metrics.
Yeah, that's right. I remember the European Commission also communicated something, I think it was December of last year, where they said that will be their preferred method moving forward, but they haven't said exactly how they're going to implement it yet. But it's, I guess, a work in progress, right? See what happens.
Yeah, well, it will be interesting because, again, you've got so many challenges in terms of securing that data. So it'll be an interesting task for them to make sure that they've got everyone in the same boat.
Great. We've just had one more question come in, so I'll ask this one and then I think we should wrap up. So the final question is, are there any countries requiring third-party verification for any of this, whether that's recycled content, carbon footprint, whether it meets the PEF? Are there any, markets that require that validation?
Well, totally, yes, there are. It does depend where you're looking. So, and I've only mentioned a few areas of the sustainability metrics you look at, but there's obviously requirements for certification around home compostability. And this starts to link us into the claims area. If you're going to make a claim, then you absolutely need to be able to validate that. And that's the majority of companies that we're engaged in. We cannot go out there and claim something's home compostable or industrial compostable without the certification. So yeah, absolutely. Similarly with the sustainable fiber sourcing, FSC, PEFC, you need those certifications if you're going to make any claims in that space. We're not putting out claims on packaging around our targets that I mentioned per se, but at the same time, you want to be able to make a zero plastic claim where you can, and obviously we need to be able to validate that the packs are zero plastics in that instance.
Well, thanks very much, Lewis. That was our final question. Really appreciate your time, and I thank you for everyone else for dialing in today and listening and giving up 30 minutes of your time to hear from us. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing all of you on a future webinar. I did just want to give one final plug. This Sunday is the 50th anniversary of the UN Conference on the Human Environment, and that was the conference that launched a lot of the international work that then became sustainable development, and then ultimately things like the Sustainable Development Goals and the things that have followed since. And so we'll be putting a blog on our website in kind of recognition of this over the next couple of days, just to recognize it. And it's, I think, a really nice thing to remember. We've had 50 years of some progress, even if it might feel like it's sort of one step forward, two steps back. There's some good things happening, and there's sort of continual international cooperation to try and achieve something positive on sustainability. So I'll leave you all with that note, and I wish you all a good afternoon, and see you again next time. Thanks again, Lewis, and thank you to all. Bye.